February 1945. A German Panther commander peers through his optics at what appears to be another American Sherman rolling through the fog-shrouded streets of a Belgian town. He smiles, almost pitying the crew inside. His 75mm frontal armor and long-barreled 75mm gun have made short work of dozens of these machines. But this tank looks different. Bulkier. The turret sits higher. Before he can process what he's seeing, a flash erupts from the American tank's barrel. The round punches through his Panther's frontal plate like paper. In his final moments, the German commander realizes something that would have changed everything: the Americans had finally brought a predator to hunt the hunters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1944 transformed the European theater into a frozen crucible where German armored superiority had become an accepted reality. For nearly 3 years, Wehrmacht tank crews had operated under a doctrine of technological dominance that seemed unshakable. The Panther and Tiger tanks represented more than military hardware. They embodied a psychological fortress that American and British tankers crashed against repeatedly, leaving burning Shermans scattered across the French countryside like discarded toys. German tank commanders entered 1945 with a confidence born from countless engagements where their advantages proved decisive. The Panther medium tank, officially designated the Panzerkampfwagen V, mounted a 75mm KWK-42 gun with a barrel length of 70 calibers. This weapon could penetrate 140mm of armor at 1,000 meters, a capability that outmatched anything the Allies had fielded in significant numbers. The Panther's frontal armor measured 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of approximately 140mm. American tank crews had learned through bitter experience that frontal engagements with Panthers were essentially suicide missions. The tactical reality shaped every armored engagement on the Western Front. American doctrine evolved around this limitation, emphasizing numerical superiority and flanking maneuvers. Sherman crews were trained to work in groups of 4 or 5, attempting to circle Panthers and strike their thinner side armor while accepting that 1 or 2 Shermans would burn in the process. This wasn't cowardice or poor training. It was mathematical necessity. The standard Sherman mounted a 75mm gun that could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor beyond 500 meters. Even the later 76mm armed Shermans struggled against German heavy armor at combat ranges. German tank crews understood this imbalance intimately. Unteroffizier Klaus Brenner, a Panther commander with the 2nd Panzer Division, recorded in his personal journal that engaging American armor had become almost routine. "The Shermans come at us like wolves, but we are armored bears," he wrote in January 1945. "Their courage is admirable, but courage without capability merely produces corpses." This wasn't arrogance in the traditional sense. It was a tactical assessment supported by engagement after engagement. The confidence extended beyond individual crew experiences. German armor doctrine in late 1944 assumed that American armor posed a threat only through overwhelming numbers. Tactical manuals emphasized conservation of ammunition and fuel rather than defensive positioning against American tanks. Panthers were positioned to counter potential Soviet armor threats expected from any sudden Eastern Front collapse, not because American armor required such preparation. The psychological impact of this superiority cannot be overstated. German tank crews slept better than their American counterparts, knowing their machines provided genuine protection. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American military planners wrestled with a problem that threatened to stall the entire European campaign. The Sherman, for all its reliability and production efficiency, was fundamentally outclassed. Reports from the front lines painted an increasingly desperate picture. Tank crews were refusing to advance in certain situations, not from cowardice but from rational calculation that frontal assaults against German armor were murder rather than combat. Junior officers were requesting transfers out of armored units. The psychological toll of climbing into a machine you knew was inferior eroded morale in ways that threatened operational effectiveness. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department had recognized this problem as early as 1942, but bureaucratic inertia, production priorities, and doctrinal disputes delayed solutions. Various heavy tank designs were proposed, tested, and rejected. The M6 heavy tank proved too heavy for existing bridges and transporters. The T-14 assault tank was abandoned due to British disinterest in the joint project. Months turned into years while Sherman crews died in machines that couldn't match their opponents. In September 1943, the Ordnance Department finally authorized development of what would become the T-26 heavy tank, later designated the M26 Pershing. The design incorporated lessons from every engagement report filed since the North African campaign. The Pershing would mount a 90mm gun, the same weapon used in the M36 tank destroyer but mounted in a fully rotating turret with better fire control systems. The armor would be substantially thicker than the Sherman, with 102mm of frontal hull armor and 110mm on the turret front. The weight jumped to 46 tons, nearly double the Sherman's 33 tons, but still manageable for European infrastructure. Development proceeded through late 1943 and into 1944, but with agonizing slowness. Each component required testing, modification, and retesting. The transmission struggled with the increased weight. The suspension needed reinforcement. The turret traverse mechanism required redesign to handle the 90mm gun's weight and recoil. Engineers worked through problems that would have been identified earlier if development had started when first needed. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Pershing existed only as prototype vehicles undergoing trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground. German intelligence tracked American tank development with characteristic thoroughness, but their assessments dismissed the potential threat. Reports noted the existence of heavier American tank projects but concluded that production and deployment timelines meant these vehicles would not appear in meaningful numbers before war's end. This assessment was essentially correct regarding most heavy tank projects. What German intelligence failed to grasp was the specific capability the Pershing's 90mm gun would provide. The 90mm M3 gun-firing armor-piercing rounds could penetrate 170mm of armor at 1,000 meters. This capability fundamentally changed the calculus of tank combat. For the first time, American armor could engage Panthers and Tigers frontally at combat ranges with realistic prospects of penetration and kill. The psychological implications of this shift would prove as important as the tactical ones, but only if German tank crews learned about this capability in time to adjust their tactics. They would not receive that opportunity. The decision to maintain operational security around the Pershing's capabilities was deliberate and carefully executed. American military intelligence understood that German armor tactics were predicated on their perceived superiority. If German tank commanders learned that American armor could now engage them frontally, they would adjust tactics accordingly, positioning Panthers in more defensive configurations and fighting from prepared positions rather than the aggressive tactics that had served them so well. The element of surprise, if preserved, could produce disproportionate tactical advantages in the critical early engagements. In November 1944, the first production Pershings rolled off assembly lines at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan. The production rate was modest, only a handful per week initially, but each completed vehicle represented a capability the European theater desperately needed. The question became deployment strategy. With limited numbers available, how should these new weapons be employed for maximum effect? The decision was made to deploy Pershings in small numbers to select units, preserving operational security while allowing field testing under combat conditions. The vehicles would be introduced without the typical fanfare that accompanied new weapons systems. No press releases, no photographer units, no mention in Stars and Stripes. Crews would be briefed under strict security protocols. Even maintenance personnel would be compartmentalized, with only essential information provided. The goal was to keep the Pershing's existence and capabilities hidden from German intelligence for as long as possible. In January 1945, the first 20 Pershings arrived in the European theater, shipped in standard cargo holds and camouflaged among routine armor replacement shipments. They were distributed to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, units positioned where contact with German armor was most likely. The crews selected to operate these machines were experienced Sherman veterans, men who understood the limitations of American armor through hard experience and could be trusted to exploit the Pershing's capabilities intelligently. Sergeant Robert Fisher was among those selected to command a Pershing. His crew had survived 11 months in Shermans, an eternity in armored warfare where crew life expectancy could be measured in weeks during heavy fighting. When Fisher first saw the Pershing, his reaction was visceral. "It looked like a tank that could actually win," he later recalled. The Sherman was a good vehicle for what it was, but facing Panthers was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. The Pershing looked like somebody finally gave us a proper gun. The training period was brief, only 3 days before the Pershings would enter combat. Crews practiced loading and firing the 90mm gun, learning its characteristics and capabilities. The penetration figures were shared under strict security, but the implications were clear. Gunners who had spent months calculating impossible angles and hoping for lucky shots could now engage German heavy armor with confidence. "They told us we could punch through a Panther's front plate at 1,000 meters, Fisher remembered. "I didn't believe it at first. We'd been told so many times that we just had to flank them, that frontal shots were waste of ammunition. This changed everything." The psychological transformation in crews learning the Pershing's capabilities was remarkable. Men who had internalized their tactical inferiority suddenly had access to a weapon system that leveled the battlefield. The confidence shift was palpable, but it came with stern warnings. Security officers emphasized repeatedly that surprise was their greatest asset. German tankers did not know these vehicles existed. They did not know American armor could now kill Panthers frontally. Every engagement had to be fought as if it might be the last before the secret was revealed. Meanwhile, German tank crews continued operations under their established assumptions. The winter offensive in the Ardennes had depleted German armored strength but not German confidence in their equipment's superiority. Panthers and Tigers that survived the Battle of the Bulge withdrew eastward, their crews certain that whatever came next, they would retain their qualitative edge over American armor. Intelligence briefings in late January 1945 made no mention of new American tank types. The threat assessment remained focused on Sherman numerical superiority and the need to conserve ammunition and fuel. Oberleutnant Heinrich Kessler commanded a Panther in the 9th Panzer Division, withdrawing toward the Rhine in late February. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His crew had knocked out 17 American tanks since D-Day, all Shermans or light reconnaissance vehicles. In his after-action reports, Kessler consistently noted that American armor rarely attempted frontal engagements anymore. "They have learned," he wrote. "They attempt flanking maneuvers or call for artillery rather than face our guns directly. This is tactically sound given their limitations." The intelligence failure that would doom many German tank crews was not a failure of collection but of analysis. German reconnaissance units had actually observed Pershings on several occasions in February 1945, but the reports were misidentified as Sherman variants or heavy tank destroyers. The visual similarity between the Pershing and up-armored Sherman models, combined with expectations that no new American tank types would appear, led analysts to dismiss or misinterpret the sightings. Even when correct identifications occurred, the reports became buried in the intelligence bureaucracy, never reaching tactical units or being incorporated into threat assessments. This intelligence failure was compounded by German operational circumstances in early 1945. The Wehrmacht was fighting a multi-front defensive war with collapsing logistics and communication systems. Tank units were being shifted constantly to address breakthrough threats. The systematic intelligence distribution that had characterized German operations earlier in the war had degraded into fragmented, delayed reporting. Even if headquarters staff had recognized the Pershing threat, communicating that information to frontline units would have been problematic. The stage was set for a technological surprise that would fundamentally alter the tactical dynamics of armored warfare in the war's final months. German tank crews operated with confidence born from 3 years of material superiority. American crews now possessed a weapon that could challenge that superiority directly. The element of surprise, carefully preserved through operational security and aided by German intelligence failures, would soon be unleashed in encounters that would shatter German assumptions and shift the psychological balance of armored combat. The first documented engagement between a Pershing and a Panther occurred on February 26, 1945, near Elsdorf, Germany. The encounter would be brief, violent, and revelatory in ways that neither crew fully anticipated. That engagement would prove to be merely the opening act in a transformation of armored warfare that would characterize the final months of the European War. The morning of February 26, 1945, brought the kind of visibility that tank commanders dreaded. Dense ground fog blanketed the approaches to Elsdorf, reducing sight lines to less than 300 meters in most directions. Sergeant Robert Fisher's Pershing moved slowly through the rubble-strewn streets, part of a mixed column advancing toward the Erft River crossing. The weight of the machine beneath him felt reassuring after months in the lighter Sherman. Every creak of the suspension and rumble of the engine carried a sense of solidity that had been absent before. Fisher's crew was on edge despite their superior machine. Combat had taught them that confidence without caution produced casualties. The fog concealed everything, turning every intersection into a potential ambush site. The gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, kept his hand on the traverse control, ready to swing the turret toward any threat. The loader, Private Anthony Russo, had a round already chambered, another cradled in his arms for immediate follow-up. In the driver's position, Private Leonard Hayes maintained formation distance, watching for Fisher's commands through the intercom. 3 blocks ahead, Oberleutnant Heinrich Kessler's Panther occupied a hold-down position behind a collapsed bakery building. His crew had established this position before dawn, following standard defensive doctrine. The location provided clear fields of fire down 2 intersecting streets while the rubble concealed their hole. Kessler had fought from positions like this dozens of times. The formula was simple and effective. Wait for American armor to advance into the kill zone. Identify the lead vehicle. Destroy it to block the street. Engage the column as targets presented themselves. The fog actually worked in his favor, allowing his stationary vehicle to remain concealed while movement would reveal advancing Americans. Kessler's gunner, Unteroffizier Franz Weber, had already ranged several key points along the approach route. His proficiency with the 75mm gun had been proven through 17 confirmed kills. Weber treated each engagement like a mathematics problem, calculating range, lead, and ammunition selection with methodical precision. This morning's fog complicated the calculations slightly, but Weber had fought in worse conditions. The Panther's excellent optics partially compensated for the reduced visibility. The radio crackled with updates from other positions in the defensive network. 2 more Panthers covered alternate approaches while a mixed force of Panzer IVs and infantry held the river crossing itself. The tactical situation favored the defenders significantly. American forces would have to advance through constrained urban terrain against prepared positions. Even with numerical superiority, the attackers faced substantial disadvantages. Kessler expected a long day of defensive fighting, but not a particularly difficult one given his vehicle's capabilities. Fisher's Pershing rounded a corner carefully, exposing only the front glacis initially while the crew scanned for threats. The fog swirled in patterns that created phantom shapes, forcing eyes to differentiate between actual vehicles and shadows. Mitchell stared through his gun sight, searching for the distinctive silhouette of German armor. The tension in the crew compartment was thick enough to taste. Every man knew that spotting the enemy first often meant the difference between survival and catastrophic death. Kessler spotted the movement first. His commander's cupola provided superior visibility compared to closed hatches, and his experienced eye caught the darker shape moving through the fog. He identified it immediately as American armor, though the specific type remained unclear through the obscuring mist. The hull shape looked wrong for a standard Sherman, bulkier and more angular, but Kessler dismissed the observation. The intelligence briefings had been clear. Americans fielded Shermans and tank destroyers. This was probably an up-armored Sherman variant or possibly one of the M10 tank destroyers. Panzer, front, 200 meters, Kessler announced calmly. His crew responded with practiced efficiency. Weber traversed the gun smoothly, finding the target through his optics. The range was almost point-blank for the Panther's powerful gun. The loader confirmed armor-piercing round ready. Weber centered the crosshairs on the target's center mass. Standard engagement protocol for this range and target type. Fisher never saw the Panther before it fired. The first indication of enemy contact was the muzzle flash cutting through the fog like lightning. The sound reached them simultaneously with the impact, a thunderous crack that merged into a screaming metal-on-metal shriek. The round struck the Pershing's frontal armor at a slight angle, the impact jolting the entire crew. In a Sherman, this hit would have meant instant death, the round penetrating and igniting ammunition or fuel. Fisher braced for the penetration, the fire, the screaming that accompanied catastrophic armor failure. Nothing happened. The round deflected off the thick frontal plate with a shower of sparks, gouging the armor but failing to penetrate. The crew sat in stunned silence for half a heartbeat, processing the impossible. They had been hit frontally by what had to be a Panther or Tiger, and they were still alive. The armor had held. Mitchell recovered first, his training overriding shock. He spotted the muzzle flash location through the fog, seeing the Panther's distinctive hull shape partially concealed by rubble. Panther identified, 2 o'clock, 200 meters, he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. His hand moved the traverse control, bringing the 90mm gun to bear on the target. Kessler's crew was already reloading, Weber's practiced motions cycling another round into the breach. The failed penetration confused them. At this range, the 75mm gun should have punched through a Sherman's frontal armor easily. Either the round had been defective or this was a heavier vehicle than expected. Kessler made an instant decision. Turret ring, target the turret ring. If the hull armor was reinforced, the junction between hull and turret offered a more vulnerable target. Fisher gave the fire command before Kessler could issue his adjusted aim point. Fire! Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun roared, the recoil rocking the Pershing back on its suspension. Inside the confined space, the sound was overwhelming despite the crew's headsets. The round crossed 200 meters in a fraction of a second, following a trajectory that centuries of ballistic science had refined to lethal perfection. The 90mm armor-piercing round struck the Panther's frontal armor slightly left of center. The impact point represented over 14 kilograms of hardened steel traveling at over 800 meters per second. The Panther's sloped frontal plate, which had deflected dozens of Sherman rounds in previous engagements, offered no meaningful resistance. The round punched through the armor like a nail through wood, the penetration creating a shower of spalling and molten metal that sprayed through the crew compartment. The effect was catastrophic. The round's momentum carried it through the driver's position and into the engine compartment, where it struck the fuel tanks. The resulting fire erupted instantly, flames roaring through the crew spaces faster than men could react. Kessler had perhaps 2 seconds of awareness before the smoke and flames consumed everything. His final conscious thought was one of complete incomprehension. American tanks could not do this. The intelligence briefings had been clear. Their armor could not penetrate frontally at this range. Fisher's crew watched the Panther burn, black smoke billowing up to merge with the fog. The kill had been clean and decisive, exactly what they had been promised the 90mm could deliver. But the emotional impact went beyond simple tactical success. For months, they had fought in machines where frontal engagements with German heavy armor meant certain death. They had internalized their inferiority, accepted it as unchangeable reality. This single engagement shattered that psychological prison. "We just killed a Panther frontally," Russo said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. The statement hung in the air, profound in its simplicity. They had done what was supposed to be impossible. The rules of armored combat had just changed, and they were among the first to understand the implications. Word of the engagement spread through radio channels with remarkable speed. Other Pershing crews heard the report and felt the same psychological shift. Tank destroyer crews, who had been told for years that they existed specifically because tanks could not handle German armor, listened with mixed emotions. Sherman crews felt vindication and frustration in equal measure. The capability had existed all along. The technology to build a tank that could face Panthers and Tigers had been available. They had simply been forced to wait while bureaucracy and production priorities ground forward. The German response to the Elsdorf engagement reflected the intelligence failure that had allowed the Pershing's deployment to remain secret. Kessler's Panther simply disappeared from radio contact, its destruction noted but not immediately investigated due to the fluid combat situation. When recovery crews eventually reached the burned-out hull 2 days later, they found evidence of penetration that shouldn't have been possible from standard American tank guns. The armor damage indicated a round larger and more powerful than anything Shermans mounted. The report crawled up the intelligence chain, competing with hundreds of other reports from a front that was collapsing in multiple sectors. Analysts noted the anomaly but lacked context to interpret it correctly. Some suggested upgunned Sherman variants. Others proposed lucky shots from tank destroyers. The possibility that Americans had deployed an entirely new tank type with superior armor and armament did not feature prominently in assessments. The cognitive bias was too strong. American tanks were inferior. This was known. Reports that contradicted this knowledge were therefore probably erroneous or represented exceptional circumstances. Additional Pershing engagements throughout early March reinforced the pattern while German intelligence struggled to grasp the implications. On March 1, a Pershing commanded by Lieutenant Clarence Smoyer engaged and destroyed 2 Panthers in the streets of Cologne. The engagement was filmed by a combat camera crew, producing some of the most dramatic tank combat footage of the entire war. Smoyer's Pershing stalked 1 Panther through rubble-strewn streets, firing and destroying it at close range, then pivoted to engage a second Panther that appeared from a side street. Both German tanks were destroyed frontally, the 90mm rounds punching through armor that had protected them against countless Sherman engagements. The Cologne engagement became famous precisely because it contradicted established expectations. Viewers watching the footage saw American armor dominating German tanks in direct combat, reversing the power dynamic that had characterized armored warfare since 1943. For German tank crews who eventually learned of these engagements, the psychological impact was devastating. Their technological superiority, the foundation of their tactical confidence, had been undermined. Hauptmann Werner Wolf commanded a Panther company in the 11th Panzer Division during the fighting withdrawal toward the Rhine. His first encounter with a Pershing occurred on March 7 near Remagen. Wolf's Panther engaged what appeared to be a Sherman at approximately 600 meters, the range well within his gun's effective envelope. The round struck home but failed to achieve a kill. The target returned fire, and Wolf's Panther was penetrated through the frontal armor. Wolf survived by abandoning the vehicle seconds before ammunition detonation turned it into an inferno. In his post-action report, written in a field hospital while recovering from burns, Wolf described his disbelief at the engagement's outcome. The enemy vehicle absorbed our hit and destroyed us with a single round. This should not be possible with American armor. Either our intelligence is catastrophically wrong, or the enemy has deployed new weapons we were not briefed about. Tank crews must be warned that American armor can now penetrate our frontal armor at combat ranges. Wolf's report reached divisional headquarters but got lost in the chaos of the Rhine crossing operations. German command structure was fragmenting under the pressure of simultaneous crises across multiple fronts. Reports that should have triggered immediate threat reassessments instead disappeared into the administrative void. Tank crews continued to engage American armor using tactics predicated on their qualitative superiority, unaware that the fundamental equation had changed. The psychological advantage the Pershing provided extended beyond its actual combat performance. American tank crews who never encountered a Pershing in person heard stories about the new vehicle and felt hope that had been absent for months. The mere knowledge that someone in American armor could face German tanks on equal terms boosted morale across armored units. Conversely, German tank crews who heard rumors about new American tanks but received no official information faced uncertainty that eroded their confidence. By mid-March 1945, approximately 200 Pershings had reached European theater, distributed across multiple armored divisions. The deployment remained relatively small-scale compared to the thousands of Shermans in service, but the tactical impact far exceeded the numbers. Pershing platoons were used as breakthrough elements, punching through German defensive positions that would have stalled Sherman units. The 90mm gun proved equally effective against fortifications, its high explosive rounds devastating to prepared positions. German defensive doctrine had to adapt rapidly to counter the Pershing threat, but the adaptation was hampered by continued intelligence failures and communication breakdowns. By the time tactical units received warnings about heavier American tanks, many had already encountered them in combat. The warnings that did reach frontline units were often vague, failing to specify the Pershing's actual capabilities or how to identify it before engagement. Tank combat in March and April 1945 took on a different character as Pershings became more common. German tank commanders could no longer assume tactical superiority in direct engagements. The Panthers and Tigers remained formidable weapons, but they had lost their psychological edge. American armor now included vehicles that could hurt them frontally, changing the calculus of every engagement. The accounts from German tank crews who survived encounters with Pershings reveal the psychological impact of losing their technological advantage. Lieutenant George Bauer, a Tiger commander with the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, described engaging what he believed was a Sherman at 800 meters. His 88mm gun round struck the target but produced no visible effect. The return fire penetrated his Tiger's frontal armor, something Bauer had believed impossible. In that moment, I understood we had already lost, Bauer later recalled. If American industry could produce tanks that matched or exceeded ours while maintaining their numerical advantage, the outcome was inevitable. The Pershing's deployment represented more than just a tactical shift in armored combat. It symbolized the broader industrial and technological competition that ultimately decided the war's outcome. German armored vehicles remained qualitatively excellent throughout the war's final months, but Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in sufficient numbers while simultaneously maintaining production of aircraft, submarines, and other weapon systems. The United States could produce Pershings while continuing Sherman production, maintaining numerical superiority while adding qualitative parity. American crews praised the Pershing's capabilities while noting its limitations. The vehicle was heavier and less mechanically reliable than the Sherman. Its ground pressure and weight caused problems with certain bridge types in muddy terrain. The 90mm gun's ammunition was bulkier and heavier than Sherman rounds, reducing the ammunition load carried. These limitations were acceptable trade-offs for the capability to engage German armor effectively, but they prevented the Pershing from completely replacing the Sherman even if production had ramped up earlier. The firepower advantage the Pershing provided allowed American armor to operate more aggressively in the war's final weeks. Tank platoons could advance with confidence that German armor no longer represented an insurmountable threat. This aggressiveness accelerated the Allied advance, particularly in regions where German forces still possessed significant armored strength. The psychological effect on German defenders was significant. Knowing that American tanks could now kill Panthers and Tigers frontally undermined defensive calculations that had relied on superior German armor. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.